Okay, welcome to another episode of the Whiskey Noobs podcast. I'm your host, Chris, and today we have a very special episode. Since we've rounded off all of the main types of whiskey, I decided we should go through and summarize everything we've covered so far for the people who are just joining. That way they can see what episode has what in it and what they want to go listen to. I do recommend you listen to all of them. But it can give people an idea of what we've covered so far. And then for all of us who are just getting through, we went through all the main types of whiskey. We've gone through some tips and tricks. We get to recap and regroup and move forward into this next part of the podcast. So, without further ado, in this episode, we are going to not drink a secret whiskey, and I'm not going to be giving you notes, and I'm not going to have you guess what it is like I normally do. I will continue doing that moving forward. But I had a different idea come from one of our listeners, and I thought it was a really good idea, and so I thought I'd make an entire episode of it. So one of our listeners, Andrew, recommended that we create an infinity bottle with all the whiskeys that we've drank and all the whiskeys we continue to drink and revisit it every few months or so, maybe every half of a year, and see what it tastes like, see how it's changed. So I thought that was an awesome idea, and I decided I was going to do a recap episode already, so the perfect thing, in my opinion, to do is go through, make an infinity bottle with all the whiskeys that we've drank so far, and taste it every once in a while along the way to see what it tastes like as if we were doing it, let's say, every month. So for those of you who don't know, an infinity bottle is an empty bottle of whiskey that you have. It doesn't need to necessarily start off as a whiskey bottle. You can also use a decanter. Then you go through and you put in a little bit of whiskey from each bottle that you open or each bottle that you finish. Or in this case, this infinity bottle, it's not going to be from an open bottle, a freshly opened bottle, or a finished bottle. It's just going to be from a bottle that I bring on the podcast. So this infinity bottle is just going to have a little bit of whiskey from every bottle that I have on the podcast. Now, it's called an infinity bottle because it never runs out. So you drink a little bit of it and then you put more in from a different bottle, and then you drink a little bit more of it at some point and you put more in for a different bottle. The idea behind that is that it always tastes a little bit new, and it's a new blend that nobody's ever had before, nobody's ever made it before. You've probably got all kinds of different whiskeys in there, so it's like a snowflake. There's no other infinity bottle just like it. I mean, it'd be nearly impossible, even if you wanted to try. So it's pretty cool because you get kind of a unique recipe from it. And then it can become kind of a special occasion bottle. I mean, you're probably going to put some more expensive whiskeys in there. So it's kind of like you can get it out on a special occasion and drink a little bit of it, but you never want to let it get too low. Otherwise, it's going to lose all of its flavor from the other whiskeys, and you got to like refill it again with new whiskeys. And you want to just kind of, it's supposed to be a slow progression. You drink a little bit, you put a little bit more in. You drink a little bit, you put a little bit more in. So that's how an infinity bottle works. I do have one of my own, but it's not made from the whiskeys specifically from this podcast. So I thought I'm going to go through and make one with just the whiskeys from this podcast per Andrew's recommendation. And I think it's going to be kind of fun. So while we do that, I'm going to walk through each episode, my favorite parts about it, or at least what the main idea of the episode was. And when we get to an episode that had whiskey in it, we're going to put it in the infinity bottle. I usually like to put all my whiskeys in the infinity bottle at the same ratio. That way it's like a super unique blend. The only exception, and you'll see when we get to the Lafroig, is something that's super duper strong, especially peated scotches. I typically do not put an equal amount in there, or it'll just overtake the whole bottle. Okay, so without further ado, let's walk through every episode that we've had so far and the best parts of each of them. The first episode was an introduction to the show called Why Drink Whiskey? And I walked through what the show was going to be like, and then most importantly at the end, I went through why do people drink whiskey? And I think that is very important, so that was my favorite part of that episode for obvious reasons. It establishes the whole need for this podcast, the whole motivation behind the podcast. So I think it's really good to sit back every once in a while and think, why do I enjoy this hobby? I mean, it's definitely good to have days where you don't think about that. You just enjoy it. But it's also good to have days where you appreciate why you appreciate it. And so I thought that was really important to establish right from the get-go, and that's why it was in the first episode. Now, the second episode was with Rebel Bourbon, so I'm going to grab that. This episode was all about learning to drink whiskey straight, especially for the very new folks who think straight whiskey tastes terrible. We walked through it with my buddy Justin. One of my favorite tricks where you mix it with a mixer. We used 7-Up because it doesn't have a lot of flavor, and you mix it and slowly up the ratio of whiskey. That way, it's slowly getting stronger and stronger until you're drinking straight whiskey. Now, in that episode, we went, I think it was like 2-to-1, 1-to-1, a half to 1, and then straight whiskey, if I remember correctly. But my favorite part of that episode was undoubtedly the fact that by the end of it, Justin was enjoying the straight whiskey because I was not sure if it was going to work doing it that quickly. So I thought it was really cool to walk through and do that because normally I would recommend you do that over the course of multiple weeks, maybe even multiple months if you got to take it slow. So when it came to it and Justin enjoyed the whiskey, and I know Justin, I've known him for a very long time, he does not like whiskey. I thought it was really awesome to see that it was able to warm up his palate like that. So we're going to put a little bit of this Rebel Yell Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey in here. It's no longer called Rebel Yell, but you can find it sometimes in the store called Rebel Yell, but they just call it Rebel Bourbon now. I'm using a shot glass to measure out the ratio. I do still have a label on the bottle, which I will take off. I just haven't had time yet. But you normally do not leave a bottle or a label on your Infinity bottle. You usually take the label off. And in goes the Rebel. Let's try not to spill it all over all of my stuff. I'd say that went pretty well. Cool. Okay. The next episode, episode 3, was tips for tasting whiskey. I walked through a few different things that you can do that's going to help the way that you taste the whiskey and help people who are now able to drink straight whiskey but still don't really taste it a whole lot and maybe it's still a little bit harsh. I walked through a few different tips that I think are very helpful for that. So if you find yourself on that level where you're like, I can already drink straight whiskey, then maybe you can skip to that episode. Although I think episode 1 was a lot of fun too. My favorite part of that episode was probably the method where you touch your tongue to the roof of your mouth over and over again or chew the whiskey. I find that is my favorite tip for tasting flavors from whiskey. I think it just works really well. I think it always helps you to capture more flavors than you were able to before. Episode 4 was Tullamore Dew versus Russell's Reserve. This episode was a ton of fun as well because it's another one of my favorite tips for pulling out more flavors and establishing that not all whiskey tastes just like whiskey. So we went through with Tullamore Dew, which is an Irish whiskey, and Russell's Reserve, which is a bourbon, and we drank both side by side to see that there are some seriously different flavors. So I walked through with my guest Bryce, who also does not like whiskey, and by the end of the episode, he was really enjoying it as well. But I do think my favorite part of that episode was probably when Bryce called whiskey hot water because it just stuck and I think it's hilarious still. So he said that any bad whiskey just tastes like you're drinking hot water, which is probably pretty accurate. So next up for our Infinity bottle is going to be the Tullamore Dew and the Russell's Reserve 10-year. Okay, we've got 3 whiskeys in our Infinity bottle now. You can see, well, that's 3 shots worth, and I think I'm going to take a small taste to see what it tastes like thus far. It's a very, very small taste because I don't want to distort it too much since we haven't put the rest of them in there yet. My initial reaction was that the Russell's was going to totally overpower it, but I will say with as much bourbon as you get from it, and you do get a lot of bourbon because you got the Russell's and the Rebel Yell in there, the Tullamore Dew does shine through a little bit, so I think that's pretty cool so far. We'll see what happens as we continue, though. I think it's going to get a lot less distinct. So the next episode that we had was the main types of whiskey and how it is made. We went through just kind of a quick glance at all the types of whiskey that you can have. That way you knew what was coming and what we were about to get a lot more in depth about. And then we talked about how whiskey is made because that's very important for when you get more in depth into the types of whiskey is to know how they're made and what I'm talking about when I say a mash bill and what I'm talking about when I say aging or finishing. It was some really important information that I think laid the groundwork for all those episodes afterward where we got a lot more in depth about the different types of whiskey. My favorite part of that episode, let's see, it had to be the distillation process because I still think that's super cool. I mean, if you ever watched like Moonshiners, it's a lot of fun. It's so interesting to see how that works and how people came up with that. So I think that was pretty neat to go through from beginning to end because I haven't in a very long time. But yeah, that was probably my favorite part of that episode. Then we moved into a really fun episode because it was one of my favorite whiskeys, and that is the Redbreast 12 and using flavor note lists. My guest Zach and I went through and we used the flavor note list that I have for the people who are on the email list. It's the Whiskey Noobs flavor list, and we used it to help pull out notes from the whiskey. So you got to where you could taste straight whiskey, you could drink straight whiskey. Then I gave a few tasting tips. Then we tried it side by side, so you got a little bit better at pulling out different flavors. Then you advanced to where we're using flavor note lists now. So you're not comparing to a different whiskey, but you're using flavor note lists to try to pull out specific flavors without anything to compare to. And I think that's a very important step to take if you want to start doing actual whiskey tastings. So that episode was also a ton of fun going through that with Zach. My favorite part of that episode had to be introducing Zach to the Redbreast because he's a big bourbon and scotch guy, not a huge Irish guy, and now he does really enjoy the Redbreast 12. So that was probably my favorite part of that episode. All right, now next into our Infinity Bottle is the Redbreast 12. Nailed it. Nothing on the table. All right, after that, we got into our first more specific episode with episode 7, and that was American whiskey. So we walked through what exactly the different categories of American whiskey are, especially bourbon. I obviously focused on bourbon because it's one of the most popular American whiskeys. I went through where bourbon got its name from and what distinguishes different types of American whiskey. We also walked through rye. But without a doubt, my favorite part of that episode was the research that I did about where bourbon got its name, because there are a lot of really cool stories about it. So if you missed that episode and you want to know what I'm talking about, you should go listen to it. It's episode 7 of the Whiskey Noobs podcast. So that's got to be my favorite part of that episode without a doubt. But after that, we had just learned about American whiskey, so it was time to drink some American whiskey. So episode 8 was my favorite starter bourbon, and that's Buffalo Trace. My favorite part of this episode had to be when Autumn, what'd she call it? Autumn was one of my two guests. I had Bryce on again with his girlfriend Autumn, and I believe she called it spicy Dr. Pepper when she put the Dr. Pepper in her whiskey because she did not like it straight. And then she said, oh, it's just spicy Dr. Pepper. And that was hilarious as well. So apparently that couple is just really good at coming up with funny sayings for whiskey. But that definitely caught me off guard and cracked me up a ton. So the next one into our bottle is Buffalo Trace. All right, if you've been keeping track, that was 2 more whiskeys, so we've probably got a good different flavor starting to gather, and I'm going to take an itty-bitty little taste to see what it tastes like. So bourbon's definitely still the most overpowering in here, which makes sense. We've got a lot of bourbon in there. But one thing that's pretty distinctly changed is the fruity floweriness that the Redbreast has. I think it's probably complemented pretty well by the darker notes that the Buffalo Trace tends to have, and the vanillas and the caramels too. So that definitely created a different taste than anything I've tasted so far, other than from an Infinity Bottle, because you've got the Tullamore Dew on the front end with its buttery notes, and then you've got all of this flowery fruitiness followed by your Buffalo Trace sweets. So that's pretty neat. Pretty neat, no pun intended, neat whiskey. Oh gosh, I'm turning into a dad. The next episode that we had was Scotch and the regions of Scotland. So it's all about Scotch whiskey, how it's made, and how the regions kind of play into it. My favorite part of this episode had to be going through and researching the regions a little bit more. I hadn't even realized, some of the regions had some distilleries that I had never even kind of heard of. Like the Lowlands, some of their most popular distilleries I had never even heard of. So it was definitely really cool to go through and learn more about that. Like I said, going into this podcast, one of my favorite parts of it is that I get to learn more about it too. I'm kind of forced to. I got to do the research for the episodes. So I love that because I get to learn all these cool new things that I didn't know before. So that was that episode, and then right after that, we wanted to learn a little bit more about the regions. So we had to try Scotch from 2 different regions. We went through Laphroaig versus Glenmorangie, both 10-year, both single malt Scotches. But Laphroaig is an Islay Scotch, Glenmorangie is a Highland Scotch. So it was Islay versus Highland, 2 different regions of Scotland. And the Islay region of Scotland is known for how peaty its whiskeys taste. If you don't know what peat is, we're about to get to the episode where I talk about that, but I do discuss what peat is and what malting is in a later episode. But This episode was a lot of fun because it was such a stark difference between the two whiskeys. My guests, Will and Tyler from the Viewer Regression Advised podcast, they were a lot of fun. It was so much fun going through it with them. It's hard to pick a favorite part because I thought the sniff and spank was hilarious when we came up with that. I think it might have been Tyler. I don't remember. But my favorite part that's probably going to take the cake has to be when I poured them the Lafroig and I looked over at both of their faces. It was absolutely hilarious, and I posted a screenshot of that on the Instagram because I thought it was so funny. They looked so deeply offended by the Lafroig and its dark flavors, its smokiness. So that had to be my favorite part of that episode. But without further ado, let's put those guys in the Infinity Bottle. So next we've got the Lafroig, and I'm going to do about half the amount because it is such a strong, strong flavor. And then we've got the Glenmorangie. We can go back to doing a full shot. I knew that one was going to spill. I filled it up too high. Oops. Okay, because we just added such a harsh whiskey to this, I am now going to take another small sip to see what it tastes like. Okay, surprisingly on the nose, it doesn't smell overly like Lafroig, but that might be because I just licked the Lafroig off my fingers, so I might be a little bit biased now. That taste is dominated by the Lafroig. I mean, without a doubt. It doesn't taste like you're just drinking Lafroig, obviously, because it's such a small amount in there, but it's pretty amazing how much it takes over this bottle. I mean, it is what? It's one of 7 whiskeys in there. And I put less of the Lafroig in there than any of the other whiskeys, so it's not even 1/7 of the bottle, probably like 1/10. And it tastes like it's probably half the bottle, is how it tastes. Astounding, the difference that peated Scotch can have on your Infinity Bottle. Take it easy. This is a fair warning to anybody listening. Take it easy with your peated Scotch if you're making an Infinity Bottle and you don't want it to taste like peated Scotch, because it's just going to take it over. All right, we're going to see if we can get rid of that flavor here with the next 2 episodes. But first, we got episode 11, which was Irish whiskey. We went all about Irish whiskey. Now, if you don't know, Irish whiskey is the first whiskey with a written account of it, and there's going to be people that argue that because they're going to say it was Scotland. But listen to that episode, and I'll tell you exactly why Irish whiskey is the first whiskey with a written account about it. I liked that episode for that reason. That was my favorite part of that episode, was looking up how Irish whiskey was potentially the first whiskey and the history of where whiskey came from. That was a lot of fun. And then we also got to talk a little bit about single pot still Irish whiskey, which I think is super unique, so that was a good time as well. But moving on to episode 12, because I want an episode where we tasted some whiskey so I can put more in my Infinity Bottle. Episode 12 was a shelf versus shelf comparison. We talked about top shelf versus bottom shelf whiskey. Now, before we got into the top shelf, we went middle shelf versus bottom shelf because I had 2 whiskeys from the same distillery, one middle and one bottom shelf. So we revisited the Buffalo Trace, which is a middle shelf whiskey from the Buffalo Trace distillery. But we also brought in Benchmark 8, which is also from the Buffalo Trace distillery, but is significantly less expensive. So Buffalo Trace around me runs you about $26 a bottle. Benchmark runs you about $10, I believe, a bottle. So it's significantly less expensive, and we got to compare the notes, and they're very similar whiskeys, but you could see a stark difference where you got a lot more flavor out of the Buffalo Trace. Then, as a little bit of a treat, I busted out a bottle of Heaven's Door. So I went through all of these whiskeys with my guest, Zach, and then I got out Heaven's Door bourbon, which is not made from the Buffalo Trace distillery. It just happened to be one of the more expensive bourbons that I had on my shelf at the time. My favorite part of this episode was when both Zach and I, without talking about it off camera or off the podcast or anything, got the same exact response from this Heaven's Door bourbon. We were both like, this is just bakery spices, Christmas spices. It was awesome. It was literally like our brains were just on the same wavelength that day, so that was a lot of fun. And I loved learning how much I enjoyed that Heaven's Door whiskey. It was absolutely phenomenal. I knew it was good, and I'd had it before, but after that tasting, I had a whole new respect for it. So that was a lot of fun in that episode. Now, I'm not going to put in Benchmark because it's pretty inexpensive, and I don't want it to just raise the alcohol flavor of this. And I'm not going to put in any more Buffalo Trace because that's already in there. So next is just the Heaven's Door. Going to fight it out with that Lafroig and see if we can get rid of some of that peated flavor. All right, after episode 12, which was a shelf-to-shelf comparison, we moved into episode 13 and we rounded out all the different types of whiskey. So we went through Canadian and Japanese whiskeys. I talked a little bit about flavored versus unflavored, and I also talked about what malting is, what the malting process is, because I talked about it so much in previous episodes. And you don't really need to know what it is, but I think it's a lot of fun and helpful and informative to know what it is when you're talking about it. So we talked about what makes a Canadian whiskey, and what makes a Japanese whiskey. And they were combined into one episode because they have quite a bit less rules than the other ones. Japanese is still very much up and coming, but they did just get a new set of rules. And then I talked about what made each of them unique, and I think that was the best part of the episode. I got to learn a little bit about both of the regions and what makes them unique, like rice whiskey in Japan, or like using two different types of whiskey and blending them in Canada, using a base and using a flavoring whiskey. So that was probably my favorite part of that episode, because it showed that every region, every type of whiskey kind of has its own flair. Now, episode 14, the most recent episode coming into this one, was Basil Hayden Rye. It was just a review of Basil Hayden 10-year rye. My favorite part of this episode was that I'd never drank the Basil Hayden yet before eating a meal, or without eating for a significant amount of time. And it gave me a whole new perspective of this whiskey, because it tasted so much more fruity, so much more like apples in like a green apple. And it still had that rye spice in it, but it was so much more subtle compared to like the green apple. And I remember that after I ate, when I had it before, I was like, oh, this tastes very much like spices and like all the things you'd typically expect from a rye whiskey. But when I drank it without eating, I got so much green apple. And so that had to be my favorite part of that episode, because I always think it's cool when I find a flavor and it's not in the flavor notes, and I'm like, there's got to be a specific reason that I'm getting this. I always think that that's pretty neat. And it shows you that when you drink one whiskey, you're not just drinking all of that whiskey. In order to really know what a whiskey tastes like, you've got to drink that same whiskey at different times of the day, before and after eating, all those sorts of things, to have a real idea of what a whiskey is always going to taste like, or what a specific whiskey will taste like. So last but certainly not least, going in the Infinity Bottle is the Basil Hayden. Spilled it again. Don't worry, table, I'm done spilling whiskey. All right, we have every whiskey that has been drank so far on the Whiskey Noobs podcast, and we're going to give it a little taste. I'm still getting a ton of Laphroaig, but I can tell that the Heaven's Door and the Basil Hayden are doing their darndest to push it out of the picture, but yeah, it still tastes quite a bit like Laphroaig. So I think that's going to be a fun thing over the next few weeks, is to continue tasting it, the next few whiskeys that we put in, and see if they start to push out the Laphroaig. It's eventually going to happen. I've made the mistake before of putting far too much Isle of Scotch in my Infinity Bottle, my personal one. So it's going to be interesting to see how many shots of other whiskeys, along with drinking this down a little bit, is it going to take to really get rid of that Laphroaig flavor. And this isn't very full yet, but that's because I'm not going to drink it very often. We're going to only visit this every once in a while. Now, another thing we can do is let it sit and see how the flavors interact with each other and mellow out a little bit. So I probably will taste it in one of the upcoming episodes to let you know if the Laphroaig mellowed out at all. But as of right now, let's give it another taste. Yeah, as of right now, it is so much Laphroaig. It kind of just tastes like Laphroaig, but like with other things going on. I don't even know how to describe it. I don't think there is any good example. I can't think of anything that like has that similar, I don't know, idea. Like maybe pineapple on pizza. It just tastes like pizza, but then there's all this other stuff going on. Or it kind of just tastes like pineapple with other stuff going on. I don't know. But the Laphroaig is super prominent in there. That's pretty amazing that it's still able to do that. It is now less than 1/9 of this Infinity Bottle. So it's probably close to, since I put so little of it in, I'm going to say it's close to like 1/12th, 1/14th of this bottle. And it is still significantly stronger than anything else in this bottle. It's absolutely amazing. But we're going to keep an eye on the Infinity Bottle as we go through the podcast, and we're going to keep putting whiskeys in it every episode where we drink a new whiskey. So once again, thank you to Andrew for this idea. Thank you for shooting me that email. I love hearing from everybody, and you guys have been doing great with the feedback. So keep it coming. I love hearing from you. Now, speaking of feedback, if you've been on my Instagram lately, you've seen I've been posting a lot about questions that people have for me about whiskey. I'm going to keep doing that. I'm going to try to post about every day, which is going to be difficult, but I'm going to try to post about every day and gather any question that you have for me about whiskey. It can be about like the topic of whiskey. It can be about just alcohol. It can be about the show and making the show, or just the show in general. It can be about me and my personal life. Ask me any question that you want me to answer, and I will answer that question on the show in a couple episodes. I do have another episode coming up where we're going to drink some scotch, and we're going to introduce somebody else who is not super experienced in the realm of whiskey. We're going to introduce him to one of my favorite whiskeys, one of my most sentimental whiskeys, because it was one of the first whiskeys that I tasted, and it clicked. I was like, this tastes actually good. It doesn't just burn. It's not just hot water. And that was really enjoyable. So I'm excited to introduce my friend to that. And I'm excited for all of you to meet him. So you're going to want to stay tuned for that next episode. But until then, keep an eye out for the Q&A and make sure that you are asking questions, anything that you want to hear. It'll be on the Instagram. I don't even know if I mentioned that yet. It's going to be on my Instagram story. It's going to be one of those little question things where you just tap and you can type any question and send it over to me. I'm saving all of them up, and I will answer each and every single one of them. I'm very excited to do so. But I think that's all we've got for today with our brand new Infinity Bottle that you can keep an eye out for in coming episodes, because we will be filling it in the coming episodes. Thank you for listening to this episode of Whiskey Noobs. If you like the show, make sure to help spread the word by introducing friends, coworkers, or anyone that you think would be interested. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the show on your favorite streaming platform, rate the show, review the show, and follow on Instagram at whiskey_noobs to stay up to date. If you want, you can join the email list by sending an email to whiskeynoobspodcast@gmail.com. You'll then be updated every month on what whiskeys I'll be drinking on the show, so you can drink right along with me and review it as we go. Thanks again for listening to the Whiskey Noobs Podcast. Learn to drink, drink to learn. The Whiskey Noobs Podcast does not support underage or otherwise irresponsible consumption of alcohol.